So I keep hearing about searing a steak in a cold pan and how it's the easiest, best way to cook a steak ever. Well, after I did the old school versus reverse sear, then reverse sear up against sous vide steak, the next round of calls came in to do this one. Now, going into this thing blind, having never done it before, I'm gonna see how good it really is. Sound good? Let's cook. When it comes to testing a method for cooking steak, I always like to use a New York strip because of its nice lean to fat ratio. A ribeye is always going to be good because it's loaded with fat. A filet mignon is always going to be tender no matter how you cook it. So New York strip is always the way to go for me. It's got a nice fat cap around the outside and has a good amount of intramuscular fat, or marbling as us old school guys would say, running throughout the middle. This is roughly 14 to 15 ounces and about 1.5 inches thick. The first thing we're going to do is pat it dry on all sides with a paper towel. Remember, moisture always prevents anything from browning when searing. Now, one of the parts of this method that stood out to me is that you're not supposed to put any salt on it until after it's done cooking. So we'll have to put that to the test, along with there's going to be no oil in the pan. I'm concluding that the steak is going to be cooked in its own rendered fat. And now that I'm thinking about it in real time, maybe a ribeye would have been better. We'll have to see. Now, once you're done patting it dry, what we can season it up with is a little bit of freshly cracked black pepper. Remember, salt doesn't come until the end. So after you season it on both sides, I'm heading over to the cooktop, and I'm going to be cooking this in a large 12-inch carbon steel pan by Made In. And this part is still so weird to me, so all I'm going to do is mop up any of that pepper that's left on the plate and put it right in the pan. I haven't turned anything on yet. This is tripping me out. So we're going to crank it onto high heat. Now, what we're supposed to do is let it sit for exactly 2 minutes untouched. After about 30 to 45 seconds, you'll start to hear that sizzle, so I know it's beginning to cook. That's that moisture escaping the steak. Then we flip it over and let it sit for another 2 minutes, again over high heat. Then after this amount of time, we're going to flip it over and immediately take the heat from high down to medium. Now we're going to sort of cook it for 2 minutes, going back and forth over medium heat until that desired internal temperature is achieved. You know, for me, I like medium rare. Now, one of my old chefs, Matt, from a restaurant I worked at, Malmaison, would have loved this procedure because when we would sear steaks over there, he would always tell me, no oil, or like a quarter teaspoon of oil. We always made beautiful seared steaks with a nice crust on there. I think they're onto something. Now, after the 5th total flip, I'm starting to notice a deep, dark brown Maillard crust form, so I know at least that part is going to be tasty. And feeling it, I'm still on the rare side, and in fact, if you're not familiar with what a steak feels like when it's to your desired internal temperature, it may be a good idea to have a thermometer in it the whole time. And after 10 total minutes of cooking, I know I've got to be close here. Let's give it another flip. Ooh yeah, looking really good. That's a beautiful crust there. Maybe 2 more minutes for me to get to that medium rare internal temperature. Now, undoubtedly, the best pans to use for this method is going to be a non-stick skillet or a carbon steel pan. Now, carbon steel has always been one of my favorite pans to cook in. And when I got serious about making cooking videos back in 2018, I knew I wanted to cook on the same pans that I used in culinary school as well as some of the restaurants that I worked at. I couldn't remember the material, but I knew it was heavier than stainless and had an offset handle. Once I got it in my hand, I knew that this is what I was missing. And if you've been following me for a while, you've undoubtedly seen me cook on these. One of my favorite things about them is that they're non-toxic, and as you continue to cook on it, it seasons and will naturally become non-stick, so you can fry an egg, sear a steak, or even just make a grilled cheese in it. Now, the made-in carbon steel pans are made in Sweden by people who have been producing carbon steel for over 300 years. And to me, it's the perfect cross in between cast iron and a stainless steel pan. It heats up really quickly, it holds heat well, but it's still light enough that you can saute in it. And after I purchased just one pan, I went all in on Made In early last year and did a full restock of all my pots and pans. Funny enough, it was a year before they even reached out to do videos like this. And you better believe if they are high quality enough to be used by over 2,000 restaurants and by one of my favorite local chefs, Grant Ockets of Alinea, then you can be sure they're high quality enough to be used at home. You won't regret it. I really think you need to get one of these carbon steel frying pans in your hands immediately. Or you can make the switch today like I did with all my pots and pans by using the link in my description to save on your order. Alrighty, the steak is looking, smelling, and most importantly, feeling like we're done here. Let's make sure. I'm going to put a thermometer right in the center. Yep, 123 degrees Fahrenheit, smack dab in the center of medium rare. Now what we want to do is get it on a rack over a sheet tray and let it rest for a total of 5 minutes. This will allow the juices to run back through to the center that were pushed out to the edges when we were cooking it. It definitely has a really nice brown crust on there, and as you know, that's where so much flavor is going to come from. That's the good stuff. Now, just looking at it, I can tell that this thing has lost a lot of moisture. My brain is already turning about how I can make that different and make the steak a lot more juicy for the next time. Now, after that resting time, I was always taught to finish steak with a little bit of clean acid and fat. So you can do this with a little freshly squeezed lemon juice and some whole butter. The acidity contrasts the fat in the steak and the butter and helps to break down the collagen a bit to help balance the flavors of the steak. Now, the goal here is to brighten it up and bring out even more flavors, and these simple techniques will do that. These little things put into practice will absolutely make you a better cook. Now, personally, I've always kept some maitre d' butter around in the freezer, and I pull it out just about every time I cook a steak. You can see how I do that in the recipe above. It's essentially a well-seasoned lemon butter with a little bit of parsley mixed in. It's simple, but it's dang tasty. Now, when people taste good food like this, they know you take it a step further, and when your love and your soul goes into food, it shows. And nothing is better than seeing smiles around the table. Trust me. All right, my resting time is over. It's got the acid and the butter on there. What we're gonna do is remove it from the rack. I just wanna slice it in half and see what I'm working with here. Oh, that's interesting. Now, my guess is we just had a very intense sear over high heat for quite a while, and a pan that really only took 30 to 45 seconds to heat up. So it sat on there for almost 11 and a half minutes, which also gives me that gray band around the outside that I know no one likes. And in addition, since it sat in the pan so long, it's going to take more time for this to cool down. Now, this opposed to a reverse sear where you're only cooking it for a total of maybe 4 minutes in a pan. But more importantly, I want to see what this tastes like. First though, we're going to thinly slice the rest of the steak. Let's just spread that maitre d' butter over it, and don't forget, we need to season with salt. So any good coarse salt will do, or even a Malden gray or Himalayan pink salt. I've got a great video on salts if you want to check that out. Moment of truth. Let's get a nice centerpiece here. It's good. I'd absolutely be pleased if I got this in a restaurant. Now you get those strong, beefy, umami flavors, and I think that's coming from that dark brown Maillard crust, and that is perfection if you ask me. Now, a couple things that were weird is I pulled it at 123 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, that is smack dab in the center of medium rare. Now, I always anticipate it going up and carryover cooking at rest, but this looks like it jumped like 10 to 12 degrees. Now, that's stuff that's usually normal for big cuts of beef, not something like this. That's a little throwing me off a little bit. Also, I don't like that I have to finish with salt. Now, I always finish all my food with a little bit of salt. This just seems weird because it's like that's the main seasoning component, and it's not until the very end. That maybe is giving me a little bit of qualm. But also, is it better than a reverse sear or sous vide? I'm not sure. I don't know that it's as tender, as juicy, as flavorful. But I do think there is a way to improve this. But first, we have to go back one day. I'm going to start off by patting the steak dry on all sides with paper towels. Again, we want a beautiful sear, and moisture prevents that. Let's give this 14 to 15 ounce New York strip a nice pre-season of coarse salt. When doing this, you want to make sure your steak is at least 1.5 inches thick. Now, this process is also known as dry brining. And throughout this procedure, while it sits, the salt will penetrate down to the center of the steak, ensuring every bite is delicious. And if you've never done this before, the steak will retain an incredible amount of moisture as the natural liquid from the steak will come to the surface and then go back into the meat. And one of the main reasons I keep the steak on a rack over a sheet tray is so that air can circulate onto the bottom part of the steak, helping to dry out the surface, which again is going to be optimal for searing. And once you've seasoned both sides, I've got quite a bit of salt that fell through that rack, so I'm just going to take the time to mop it up on the sides of the steak that I couldn't quite season up when doing so. Next, it's going in the refrigerator for as little as 4 hours and all the way up to 24 hours. For me, I go overnight, roughly 16 to 20 hours. Then when you're ready to cook the steak, pull it out and let it sit at room temperature just for about 10 minutes to take the chill off. At this time, we're going to season it up generously on both sides with freshly cracked black pepper. Now that I've done this once, I know what I'm looking for, and I'm going to change a few things up here. So we're going in that same 12-inch carbon steel pan. Yes, I've cooled it down. I'm touching it with my hands. We're good to go. This time, though, I'm going to take the steak and I'm going to set it up on the side and put it fat cap side down over high heat for a total of 2 minutes. Now, during this process, I think we're going to be able to render a little bit more fat to try and get a better sear on both sides of the steak. And after 30 to 45 seconds, you're starting to hear those nice sizzle noises and the fat you can see is starting to render. After those 2 minutes, I'm going to set it down in the pan and let it sit for exactly 1 minute untouched. And one thing I will say about this method definitely produces a lot of smoke, so I need to crank that fan on a high. All right, after that 1 minute cooking period of being on the side, and you've seen me do this before, I'm going to come back using my tongs and I'm going to move the steak around in a circular motion, really to kind of mop up all that fond and help create a darker, more delicious brown crust. After 1 minute of doing this, we're going to flip the steak over. Yep, you can already see just after that amount of time, it's already getting darker. Then, after the flip, we're going to let it sit untouched for 1 minute. It's starting to smell really good in here. Then, come back in the same process, give it those circular motions for an additional minute. Then we're going to flip it and have a look. Oh yeah, starting to brown up really nice. Then turn the heat down to medium, just like in the other procedures, which were actually created by some of the folks over at Cooks Illustrated, just in case you didn't know that. We're going to let this sit for 2 minutes, completely untouched. Then we're going to flip it over and sear it for another 2 minutes. And the crust and the smells in here are absolutely fantastic. Now, one thing I've definitely noticed about this procedure is that the oil splatter isn't nearly as much as it is when you're searing in oil and adding on all that butter for basting. So that I can at least appreciate when it comes to keeping a cleaner kitchen. Also, I'm definitely noticing that brown crust on the outside is far more intense than the first time we did this. I think this one is going to be really, really good. Now, because the other one seemed like it was slightly overdone at 123, I'm pulling this one at 115 degrees Fahrenheit to see where we're at. Now, one thing that's always been interesting to me is whenever you pre-season or dry brine a steak, it becomes really hard to touch it and feel it to know where it's at internally because it's so pumped up with its own liquid, which really means it's going to be super juicy. So we're going to let this rest just like the other steak for exactly 5 minutes. And one thing I can absolutely tell is this is rendering a lot less of its own moisture, and you can just see that in the bottom of that pan. After that resting period, we are going to do the same thing and add on a little bit of that maître d' butter. Now let's slice this one in half and see where we're at. And yeah, that definitely looks a lot better internally. And as you can see, just like the first steak though, you still get that undesirable gray band around the outside. Now for me, it doesn't bother me that much. It's much more about aesthetics than it is taste. But that's just my opinion. And still, don't forget, you're cooking a steak in a hot pan for almost 12 minutes. This is going to happen. Just like the other one, let's slice it up and definitely no need to season it. Let's get in this. Oh yeah. Definitely juicier, definitely more flavorful, and a bit more tender as well. That pre-seasoned salt, that went a long way into making this a lot better steak. I think the sear too was better. Maybe starting on that fat cap, letting some of the fat render first before searing it, and then that circular motion. I'm telling you, this is the one. The other one, it's pretty good. This one, infinitely better. This is the method. Now, this is a great recipe because it literally, and I hate using the word literally, but it literally cooks in under 10 minutes, which means more time around the table with friends and family to connect. Now, is this as good as the sous vide or the reverse sear? It's pretty dang close. Now, if you love steak and want to try something that you may only get at a steakhouse, you have to check out my reverse smoked then seared tomahawk rib steak with a cowboy butter. Yo, that thing is ridiculous. I've got a great recipe video. I'll see you on there.